Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus. And today we're looking at Jesus' warning or warns against wrong teaching. And if you've been following along with us, we're going through this chronologically, so we're going through it in order, and we're looking at the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what we're seeing here is yesterday we looked at the Pharisees and the Sadducees testing Jesus, demanding a miracle, and so. We're going to be in Matthew 16. Both of these readings, one's from Matthew 16, and then the other one's from Mark 8. We have the scripture up here on the screen. And what we're looking at is so after the Pharisees and the Sadducees demand a miracle from Jesus, and Jesus doesn't give them one, they go and cross the other side of the lake. And so we start in verse 5 here. And as they start on the other side of the lake, the disciples discovered here that they had forgotten to bring any bread. So again, we see a learning opportunity or teaching opportunity for Jesus here. And he says to them, "Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." So they forgot bread, and Jesus says, "Watch out." And then he brings up the yeast, and anyone who's ever cooked bread or used bread, you know that you to put a little tiny bit of yeast in the bread and it causes it to rise a whole lot. So after he says this, they begin to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. And Jesus knew what they were saying. So it's like Jesus trying to get them to understand what he's saying. And they start arguing about who didn't bring bread. And Jesus knew what they were talking about. He says, "Look, you have so little faith." All right, he chastises them here. "Why are you arguing with each other about having no bread?" He's like, "Don't you even understand yet?" They didn't get what he was trying to say. He's like, "Don't you remember the 5,000 I fed with the 5 loaves and the baskets of leftover you picked up? Or the 4,000 I fed with the 7 loaves?" We've looked at those two stories in the last week or two. And the large baskets left over there. Why can't you understand that I'm not talking about bread? Right? He's like, why don't you get that I'm not talking about bread here? So again, I say, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then at last, right here, they finally understood that he wasn't speaking about the yeast and bread, but about the deceptive teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so to get a full understanding of this, and we need to apply this to ourselves. And so the one thing I try to make us understand or help us understand, and I know this seems harsh, but in Christianity, in the church today, there are a lot of Pharisees and Sadducees, right? A lot of the churches are very Pharisaic. A lot of Christians can be very Pharisaic, and what I mean by that is it's all about appearances, it's all about appearing, it's all about our works, right? It's the you know it's expecting people to holding people up to a certain standard while not holding yourself or those around you up to another certain standard. It's calling out other people's sin while ignoring the blatant sin in your life or the things that you're doing, right? And especially from a leader, because the Pharisees were the religious and the Sadducees were the religious leaders of the day, and they were morally corrupt, right? And but yet at the same time expecting all the people below them to abide by every single rule. And we see this a lot in the church, right? We're seeing, like, I've experienced this. I know y'all have experienced this, and we're seeing it on large levels of of failures. If anyone follows um the some of the stuff out of Atlanta, Northport Ministries and stuff like that, there's one of the leaders there, right? They just had a huge moral failure, had to step down from, and so it's just we're seeing all this stuff where it's like, I'm going to sit up here and I'm going to demand these things from you, but I'm not going to hold myself to the same standard. Again, we don't expect ourselves to be perfect, but we can't teach these things and then to start to teach, and then what that leads to is this appearance, what I call appearance Christianity, right? Where we have to appear like a certain way, right? We have to make sure we look the holiest and we are perceived as, and it becomes a self-righteous attitude, right? And then what happens is you see these churches, right? And I've sat in meetings and I've listened to this, and I'm not saying this again, I'm not saying this to talk bad, but I've sat in meetings and I've listened to this where it's like, well, we've got to make sure this church over here doesn't think this about us, or I mean, it was a competition of like trying to be better than other churches, or making sure that we appeared to fall in line with all, this particular church over there. And it's like, what are we doing? Why are we teaching this kind of stuff? And so this gets back to the yeast that Jesus is talking about here, right? The yeast that he's talking about putting into bread, you put a little pinch of yeast in dough, and it will cause it to, right? It permeates the entire thing. And so his example here is saying, look, it doesn't take but a little bit of false teaching to corrupt the entire church. Right. And so we have to be very careful with that. And that's why, one of the things we try to emphasize on, especially like, and I talk about it here, right? Don't just believe something because I teach it, right? Because believe it or not, I've taught things that are wrong, and I'll probably teach things that are wrong in the future. But, we've got to be careful with that, right? But the thing is, the one thing is what we have to do as teachers, right? If I teach something that's wrong, or I say something that's wrong or incorrect, right? I have to be willing to say, oh, I messed up there, right? And not proceed forward, and be willing to admit, oh, that was a wrong teacher, or I was incorrect in that, right? And and have that willingness to admit that you're wrong. And so Jesus is using this example of how a small amount, right, even a little minor amount can do that. And the wrong teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees were leading people astray, right? And in Luke 12, right, it talks about the hypocrisy of them. And the two things were interlaced because they were hypocrites, right? They were calling people to do certain things, behave a certain way, why they themselves weren't, right? And so that's where we go. And so the most sinister influence of the Jewish leaders was a pragmatic doctrine that made room for hypocrisy, and a lot of it was works based, right? A lot of it was that works based. It's like, well, if you don't do all these things a certain way or this particular way, then you're wrong and you're sinful, and in some cases, if you didn't do it this way, then you're going to hell. And it's counter to, if you look at the teachings of Jesus, even in the Old Testament, right? There was a lot of things they were called to do, but even in it, all went back to the condition of the heart. And we see that in the New Testament. We weren't called in the New Testament to do things exactly a certain way all the way through the Bible. We talked about this in church today, right? That was the wonderful thing about, we're called to do certain things in worship, but there's nothing that details exactly how our worship should look. Right. And that's why even in the New Testament, you had all these different approaches, cultural approaches to worship. And again, that would be like saying in America, it's like the certain church saying, oh, well, we have the way, we're the only way, and this is the only way you can do it. And then you go over to another culture like China or Africa, and maybe in China there's no way they could even worship that way because of it's like, well, are they going to hell because of that? And so we've got to get away from this idea that it's the things that we do that saves us, right? Even in worship, right? Again, our there are things around worship of where we do need to worship in a respectful way, right? But it doesn't have to be like this laid out perfect schedule of events. And if you don't do these things exactly the same way, and the word, the singing be a certain way, and communion be a certain way, and all this stuff, then you're wrong, right? It just says do it. It says to sing. It says to, well, actually, it doesn't actually command us to take communion every single Sunday. It just says take communion, or anytime you take a part of it, to remember it, right? To drink anytime you have bread and wine, to take part of. And we see examples of them doing it sometimes on the first day of the week, but then we see other examples where they did it every time they met. And so, we got this Americanized version of Christianity that we teach, but we have to remember that that's not how it was. And so, there's different expressions and different ways you can worship. There's things, like I said, there's things we're called to do. We are called to sing. We're called to pray. We're called to teach or have instruction, right? And typically back then, it was 3 or 4 people, right, that would talk or speak up or teach, And so we have all those things, but again, it's not about exactly how you do them. It's about the condition of your heart while you're doing them. And that's the thing that we've got to get into and look at and get away from this hypocritical type of teaching, and and so Jesus, right, he rebukes them. He rebukes them for their hypocrisy again and again. And Jesus rebuked the disciples for their hard hearts. And I think today's hard hearts, right, is this idea that, well, the worship is best conducted our way, the one way, right? The our way, and which has worked for us for what, the last 40 or 50 years, right? We've been doing it this way for, maybe some cases now 60, 70 years. And it doesn't need to be changed. And unless you do it this way, then you're sinning and going to hell. I mean, people would be like, well, that's extreme, Chad. Trust me, I've heard people say it, right? I've heard people say, that if you do not do this particular thing in your worship, then you're sinning and going to hell, right? And so we've got to get away from, and I'm not just like, a lot of these teachings go beyond just worship, right? There's things about the way we live our lives. It's getting away from that idea that the things we do are what saves us or doesn't save us. Okay, and we need to it's our faith. And if we have a true faith in Jesus, then we're going to follow the things that he commands us to do, right? There are things that he commands us to do, and we're going to do, or do them to the best of our ability. We're not going to be perfect in them, right? But then what we've done as a group of churches and denominations, right, is we've added all these things. We've added all these traditions and stuff. We've talked about this, and we've added them all in, and we've made those more important than the actual commands of Jesus, right? And I'll give you an example here. My context or our background, we came from a denomination that believed in a cappella music, right? And here's the reality, right? More people, if I got in front of the congregation there and I started using instrumental music to worship God, most of the people would walk out, right? Because that's not their belief and they believe that's wrong. Okay? But while at the same time with that, hardly anyone was evangelizing. And that's following the Great Commission. And we see that throughout all of our churches, all the denominations, that only like 2 to 3% of the people are actually fulfilling the Great Commission. Now, which one's scriptural, or which one's a command, which one's not, right? The instrumental music is a interpretation of one verse. The go and make disciples is a direct command mentioned many times in it. And so why is there a passion or a greater commitment to something that's not a command, and there isn't such a passion to something that is a command? Because what we've done is we've taken our traditions, we've taken things that are stuff that we've developed over maybe 100 years, 50, 60, 70 years, and we've made those more important, and we've made those things that are to the point of saying those are salvation issues when they're not. And so that's what Jesus is talking about here. That's what Jesus is getting at. It's like when you start teaching these things, this is what the Pharisees did. The Pharisees had taken things and made them scripture or commands around salvation when they weren't, right? And so we've got to be very careful that we do not become like the Pharisees, that we do not become like the Sadducees in this, and make these things so important that that's what we focus on, and we ignore the things, the very core of what we've been called to do. And so that's what I know he is getting at here. And we got to be very careful around that. Again, I know it's human nature, tradition, those type of things. We love to get into a comfortable routine of doing the same thing over and over again. And then when we've done that for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, right, then it becomes like, well, we've always, so there must be a biblical command somewhere in there. And then we was like, oh, if you actually sit down and study a lot of this stuff, there's no biblical commands around it. It's like, well, I read this verse and it seems like they did this, so this is what we're going to do. And then it's like, well, then we force it all the way into scripture when it's not scripture. And so that's we've got to be very, very careful about our teaching. And then there's some things that we teach that is just wrong, right? Or we haven't studied correctly, or we haven't actually looked at the entire context. And this is one of the things that we try very hard to do, is I very rarely am I going to take one verse and build a theological point off one verse. Because you can't, you got to look at the entire Bible. So if we look at one verse and it's like, oh, well, we've got to do that because this one verse says this, and it's like, well, wait a minute, let's look at the entire context of the New Testament. Let's say we'll just use the New Testament, for example, right? And it's like, hey, look at this verse and what it says. Oh, we can't do that then. But wait a minute, over here they were doing it over here. So what's the context of this verse, right? Or over here this was allowed, but and so we've got to stop doing those type of things, cherry picking verses to meet what we think it should say or what we want it to say, and actually read the entire Bible. Well, entire Bible, but especially the entire New Testament in the context of what it was written, and look at all the examples, not just one verse or a particular section, and say, oh, this is what, we're going to build our entire theological foundation on this. And so that's what we try to do. Again, I'm emphasis on this because I hate to say this, but there are a lot of wrong teachings in the church today, right? And I've been guilty of it, and a lot of it's because we've established this foundation of, well, if someone gets up and teaches something, we're not allowed to question it. I've had people, I've witnessed people get up in front of congregations and be like, you know, basically you have to follow these people, no questions asked. Literally, they said, no questions asked, and it's like, wait a minute, that's not what we see in the Bible. We're to reproof, right? We're to go against. We're not say go against, but we're to correct and go and learn, right? If you're in a situation, right, where you can't question the people or you can't question the beliefs, then that gets very cult like, right? And we need to make sure we don't get into that. And that's one of the things we do is we sit down and we have discussions around a lot of these things, and we challenge our beliefs, and we look at it and say, you know what, I've been taught this all my whole life, but in looking at it in full context, maybe this is not right, and that's okay. And it's like we've got to be willing to be like, some things we may have taught are wrong, right? I've talked to my dad about this. My dad's preacher, who's been a preacher for over 40 years, and he says, look, there's things that I taught 20, 30 years ago that I would never teach now, right? And so because we learn, we grow in our teachings, but we have to be willing to accept the fact that maybe something we were taught wasn't entirely correct, or the context wasn't correct, and we need to be able to willing to do that. The Pharisees weren't willing to do that, right? And if you're not willing to do that, you're not going to grow. You're not going to grow as a Christian. You're not going to continue to grow, because you're going to continue to see things differently as you get older. I tell you right now, I see things a whole lot differently than I did in my 20s, now that I'm in my 40s. And so we've just got to make sure that we are open to learning new, to observing and reading the scriptures, and not getting so locked down into our beliefs that if someone challenges it, that we're not willing to actually look and see if maybe they're right. And then that's what we've got to do. And I know I've gone on a little bit long about this one, but I think this is a very important thing, because I think one of the failures in leadership in the church is across the board, is that we refuse to accept the fact that something we've learned or taught may be wrong, right? And we refuse to, we'll spend our time, and I've seen this, man, we'll spend our time attacking other churches and attacking other people who, well, this so and so, and write letters and write blog posts about these things, instead of sitting down and saying, hey, let's look at this, let's talk about this. We've lost that ability to have discussions around things, because too many times it's become, I'm going to stand in front of the room, I'm the pastor, I'm the elders, and whatever I say goes, and you're not allowed to question it. We've allowed that sort of warped authority inside the churches, and that's not what's supposed to be there. That we're supposed to be a guiding, right? But it doesn't mean you can't question teachings. It doesn't mean you can't, again, in a respectful manner, right? We're supposed to approach everything with love, and that's what we should be doing, right? And I'm the same way. If I taught something, I've had wonderful conversations with people about where I've taught something, and they're like, well, I don't believe that. It's like, well, or they could try to come back with a response. Like, let's sit down and discuss it, right? There's been times where I've taught something, and someone came to me, Chad, I don't know if that's right. And I'm willing to look at it and say, hey, you know what? I think you're right there. And if I do that, then I'll get on and say, hey, I said this, or I taught this, and you know what? After looking at it, I was wrong. And we have to be willing. If we can get to that, man, how much the church was going to grow. Because when the outside world sees a group of people who say, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm not going to listen to anything you say, I'm not going to have any discussion about it whatsoever, you just have to believe what I say, they're not going to respect that. No one's going to respect that. So we've got to get away from that kind of belief and that kind of ideology. Again, I appreciate everyone for watching. I hope this this lesson, I mean, even though it's a short verse, it's very, very impactful, because I think it's one of, like I said, it's one of the core things I think that's really affecting the church. There's a lot of what I would call wrong teachings or false teachings that we see. A lot of it leads back to a Pharisee type of attitude, and we need to make sure that we get rid of that, and we humble ourselves, and that our teaching comes out of a place of love and kindness and mercy, and not this Pharisaic, do what I say, you have to do these things, rule of it even goes to like shame and that kind of stuff, because that's not what we saw Jesus do. Again, appreciate everyone for watching. If you find this helpful, if you find this useful, please share it with others. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please go ahead and do so. And just, we're going to continue to put teachings out like this, and continue to go dive deeper into some of these teachings as well. Right now we're just going through the gospels, but we are going to go deeper into some of our theology and some of the things that people struggle with, and problems people have, because that's going to be one of the core things we want to get at too. Again, thank you so much, and I appreciate everyone for watching.